The date is December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Belgium. Temperature, -14 degrees Celsius. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, commander of Army Group B and architect of the Wehrmacht's most ambitious counteroffensive since Stalingrad, stands behind the tree line of the Schnee Eifel, studying the road through his field binoculars. Smoke curls from a burning American half-track in the distance. The Germans have broken through. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, is succeeding beyond even the most optimistic projections from OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Hitler's high command. The Americans are in chaos, or so it appears. Model lowers his binoculars and turns to his operations chief, Generalleutnant Hans Krebs. They have just received reports from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler, the Führer's own bodyguard formation, now leading the spearhead west. The reports say something unexpected, something that does not fit the pattern. American soldiers caught in the flanks, in the rear, completely surprised by the German breakthrough, are not retreating south in organized columns. They are not falling back to prepared positions. They are not forming defensive perimeters and waiting for orders, as doctrine and common sense would dictate. They are counterattacking, immediately, with whatever they have. Platoons striking back against companies, companies hitting back against regiments, individual tank commanders, cut off and alone, driving their Shermans directly at German columns, rather than seeking cover. Model had seen the British in North Africa. He knew how they fought, methodically, deliberately, with a careful respect for logistics, and a healthy instinct for self-preservation. He had fought the Soviets on the Eastern Front, mass, depth, and a willingness to absorb catastrophic punishment before the great counterstrokes came, planned from Moscow, coordinated across hundreds of miles. But these Americans, these strange, infuriating, inexplicable Americans, a captured American sergeant from the 99th Infantry Division, dragged before German intelligence officers near Losheim on the morning of December 17th, was asked why his squad had attacked a German machine gun nest rather than surrendering when surrounded. The sergeant, his name recorded in the German after-action report simply as Keller, reportedly answered without hesitation, "We figured if we were going to get killed anyway, we might as well take some of them with us. Besides, nobody told us we were supposed to stop." Sergeant Keller, 99th Infantry Division, as recorded in Wehrmacht after-action report, Losheim, December 17th, 1944. Model is said to have read this report twice. Then he set it down and said nothing for a long moment. His staff, assembled around the map table in the farmhouse outside Prüm, waited. Finally, Model looked up. "Who trained these men?" he asked. No one answered, because no one in that room fully understood the answer. But the answer existed. It had existed for 17 years, hammered into the clay of the American military mind at a place called Fort Benning, Georgia, by a single visionary officer who believed the entire way Western armies fought was fundamentally, lethally wrong. His name was George Catlett Marshall, and the doctrine he built, the culture of immediate counterattack, of decentralized initiative, of the aggressive refusal to accept a tactical disadvantage as a final verdict, would be tested here, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, in ways that would determine the outcome of the entire war in Western Europe. This is not simply a story about the Battle of the Bulge. It is not merely a chronicle of Bastogne or the 101st Airborne or Creighton Abrams relief column. This is the story of an idea so radical for its time, so counterintuitive in the face of enemy fire, that it had to be drilled into soldiers for years before it became instinct. An idea that separated the American way of war from every other army fighting in the Second World War. When the Germans attacked, the British planned their response. The Soviets absorbed and then answered. But the Americans hit back before the blow had even finished landing. Over the next 55 minutes, we will trace exactly how that instinct was born, how it was forged, where it nearly failed, and where it achieved something the Wehrmacht, for all its tactical brilliance, never expected to encounter. an enemy that became more dangerous the harder you hit it. The Germans had a word they used for what they encountered in the Ardennes, a word that crept into after-action reports and prisoner interrogations and intelligence summaries throughout December 1944 and January 1945. The word was unberechenbar, unpredictable. They meant it as a criticism. History recorded it as the highest possible compliment. To understand why Marshall's reforms were so revolutionary, you must first understand what he was trying to fix. The year is 1927. The United States Army is an institution in deep denial about the lessons of the First World War. Across the Atlantic, British and French military theorists are drawing their own conclusions from the catastrophe of the Western Front, conclusions that would, within 2 decades, prove catastrophic in themselves. The dominant tactical doctrine of the Western Allied armies in the 1920s can be summarized in 3 words: consolidate, coordinate, counterattack. In that order, with emphasis on the first 2. When under fire, a unit was expected to go to ground. Assess, communicate the situation up the chain of command. Wait for orders, prepare a coordinated response. Then, and only then, act. This doctrine had been born in the mud of Flanders, where uncoordinated attacks had broken against prepared defenses and accomplished nothing but the stacking of bodies. The lesson the survivors took from the Somme and Passchendaele and Verdun was: never act in haste, never attack without preparation, never commit your forces until the situation is clear. It was a reasonable lesson. It was also, in the fast-moving mechanized warfare that was coming, a lethal one. Captain George Marshall, not yet a general, not yet Army Chief of Staff, not yet the man Churchill would call the true organizer of Allied victory, watched the Army's training exercises throughout the early 1920s and saw something that disturbed him profoundly. He watched units freeze under simulated fire. He watched officers wait for orders that were slow to come through hierarchical chains of command. He watched the doctrine of consolidation and coordination produce, over and over again, the same result. By the time the American response was ready, the tactical situation had changed completely. The enemy, even a simulated enemy, had moved on. Marshall wrote about this repeatedly in his personal correspondence and in official memoranda that circulated through the War Department with the quiet urgency of a man who knows he is right, but has not yet been given the authority to act. On it, in a letter to his colleague Colonel Morrison Stayer in October 1923, Marshall was characteristically direct. The fatal tendency is to do nothing while waiting for the situation to become clear. The situation never becomes clear. The enemy is not obligated to stand still while we think. Every minute of delay is a minute he is using against us. Colonel George C. Marshall, letter to Colonel Morrison Stayer, October 1923. The British Army, for all its courage and professionalism, had institutionalized exactly this tendency. Its doctrine, codified in pamphlets, drilled in exercises, embedded in the promotion system, rewarded caution and penalized recklessness. An officer who waited for orders and then failed was judged less harshly than an officer who acted on initiative and succeeded, but had not been specifically authorized to do so. Field Marshal Sir John Dill, who would serve as Britain's senior military representative in Washington during the war, and who knew Marshall better than almost any other Allied officer, articulated this difference with painful honesty in his private diaries in 1942. The American junior officer operates on what he believes his commanding officer would want him to do. The British junior officer operates on what his commanding officer has told him to do. In a fast-moving battle, this is not a small distinction. Field Marshal Sir John Dill, Private Diary, March 1942. The Soviet Army presented a different problem. Not excessive caution, but excessive centralization. By the late 1930s, Stalin's purges had decapitated the Red Army's officer corps. Approximately 35,000 officers arrested or executed between 1937 and 1938, including 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, 13 of 15 army commanders, and 50 of 57 corps commanders. The institutional knowledge, the professional confidence, the willingness to exercise independent judgment that had taken decades to build, liquidated in 2 years. The result was an army that could absorb punishment on a scale no other force in human history had ever matched, but could only respond to that punishment through orders that traveled from Moscow through Army Group headquarters, through Army headquarters, through corps, through division, through regiment, down to the men in the frozen trenches who were already dead by the time the orders arrived. Marshall saw all of this, and he saw something else, something that would become the foundation of everything he tried to build. In every war, in every army, the tactical unit that mattered most was not the corps or the division or even the regiment. It was the platoon. 30 to 40 men under a lieutenant or a sergeant who was often 19 years old. This young man, in the first seconds of a firefight, would make a decision, cover and wait, or attack, and the outcome of that 30-second decision, multiplied across thousands of engagements, would determine the battle. The battle would determine the campaign. The campaign would determine the war. If you wanted to change how armies fought, Marshall understood, you did not rewrite doctrinal manuals. You changed what 20-year-old sergeants did in the first 5 seconds after the shooting started. And to do that, you needed a school, a place where the doctrine would be lived, breathed, drilled, and turned from an intellectual proposition into a physical reflex. Fort Benning, Georgia, 1927. When Brigadier General George Marshall arrived at Fort Benning, Georgia, in November 1927, as Assistant Commandant of the Infantry School, he found an institution teaching the same tactics that had failed on the Meuse-Argonne in 1918. The curriculum was built around elaborate written orders, meticulous coordination, and the careful management of risk. It produced officers who were thorough, methodical, and slow. Marshall spent the first 3 months simply watching, attending lectures, sitting in on map exercises, observing field problems, taking notes in the small, precise handwriting that would characterize his correspondence for the rest of his life. Then he began to dismantle everything. The first thing Marshall attacked was what he called the 5-paragraph order culture, the elaborate written operational orders that officers were expected to produce before taking any significant action. In training exercises, these orders routinely ran to 6, 8, 12 pages. They were thorough, they were comprehensive, they were produced while the tactical situation deteriorated around the officers writing them. Marshall replaced the elaborate order with what he called the 2-sentence order. You stated the mission, you stated the commander's intent. Everything else was left to the subordinate's judgment. His deputy at Fort Benning, Major Omar N. Bradley, who would command the largest American field army in history, 17 years later, recalled Marshall's explanation during one of the early faculty meetings. If the lieutenant has to wait for me to tell him exactly what to do in a firefight, then either I have failed to train him or he has failed to learn. Either way, the time for training is past, and both of us are in trouble. Brigadier General George C. Marshall, Fort Benning Faculty Meeting, January 1928, as recalled by Major Omar N. Bradley, who would go on to compile his own extraordinary record as a trainer of soldiers, absorbed Marshall's philosophy completely. Years later, reflecting on the Fort Benning period in his memoir A Soldier's Story, Bradley identified the core of what Marshall was building. Marshall was not trying to create officers who made good decisions. He was trying to create officers who made decisions, fast, decisively, and then adapted when those decisions needed changing. The distinction sounds subtle. In combat, it was the difference between life and death, and, in December 1944, between victory and catastrophe. The physical training at Fort Benning was transformed equally radically. Marshall introduced what he called ambush problems, exercises in which units were deliberately, suddenly placed in tactically untenable positions with no warning and no briefing, and ordered to respond immediately. The standard response for the first months was invariably the wrong one. Leaders went to ground, assessed, attempted to communicate upward, waited for guidance. Marshall would terminate the exercise, and the debriefing would be the same each time. "You waited," he would say. "Tell me what the enemy did while you waited." The answer, always, was the same. The enemy had advanced. The enemy had flanked. The enemy had consolidated a position that could now only be taken at much greater cost, if at all. Marshall's answer to the problem of freezing under fire was not inspirational speeches about courage, it was conditioning. He made counterattacking feel safer psychologically than taking cover. He drilled units in immediate action drills until the response was automatic, not thought, but reflex. Hit back, flanked, turn and engage. Surrounded, attack outward. The reasoning was tactical but also psychological. A unit moving toward the enemy is harder to kill than a unit lying still. Moving units present uncertain targets. Moving units demonstrate initiative that confuses and disrupts enemy decision-making. And critically, moving units do not give their own soldiers time to become paralyzed by fear. Captain Joseph Stilwell, who was serving on the Fort Benning faculty at the time, and would later command all Allied forces in the China-Burma-India theater, captured Marshall's thinking in a letter to his wife. Marshall says the worst thing you can do in a firefight is nothing. He says nothing is never a neutral option. Nothing is always a decision, the decision to let the enemy choose the outcome. Captain Joseph Stilwell, letter to his wife, Win Stilwell, March 1929. Marshall also addressed something that no Army training program had previously confronted directly: the psychological reality of combat fear. Previous doctrine essentially pretended that training had eliminated fear, or at least made it irrelevant. Marshall took the opposite approach. He acknowledged explicitly, to his instructors and through them to students, that fear was universal, inevitable, and not a disqualifier for effective action. What mattered was not the absence of fear, but the trained habit of action in spite of it. This was revolutionary. In 1928, for an American Army general to say openly that soldiers would be afraid, and that the job of training was not to remove that fear, but to give them something stronger than fear, a practiced, automatic response, was to break fundamentally with the entire tradition of martial instruction in the English-speaking world. The men Marshall trained at Fort Benning between 1927 and 1932 would go on to hold virtually every significant command in the American Army during the Second World War. The list reads like a roll call of history. Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group in Europe; Lawton Collins, who commanded 7 Corps at D-Day; Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff; Matthew Ridgway, who would command airborne forces in both Europe and Korea; Maxwell Taylor, who would lead the 101st Airborne Division, the very unit that would hold Bastogne. These men did not merely learn tactics at Fort Benning. They absorbed a philosophy, a way of seeing combat, a deeply ingrained conviction that the proper response to being hit was to hit back, immediately, aggressively, before the enemy had time to consolidate his advantage. When the Germans broke through the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, they were not simply attacking an army. They were attacking an institution that had spent 17 years preparing, at the molecular level, for exactly this kind of shock. The shock came. The counterattacks followed, faster, more instinctive, more disruptive than anything the Wehrmacht had planned for. But first, the doctrine had to be tested. And its first test, in North Africa in 1942, nearly destroyed everything Marshall had built. February 14, 1943. The Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, veteran of the Western Desert, commander of the Afrika Korps, launched what would become the most humiliating defeat in American military history up to that point. His panzer forces drove through unprepared American positions, annihilated the 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A, and pushed the U.S. II Corps back more than 80 kilometers in 48 hours. The casualties were severe: 6,500 Americans killed, wounded, or captured, 183 tanks lost, 208 artillery pieces captured or destroyed, an entire corps in disarray. More damaging than the statistics was the observation that filtered back through Allied intelligence and through the after-action reports that American commanders wrote with painful honesty. American units had not counterattacked immediately. They had done exactly what Marshall's doctrine said they should not do. They had gone to ground, they had waited for orders, they had treated the doctrine of immediate response as something appropriate for training exercises, but perhaps too aggressive for actual combat against a proven, elite enemy. Rommel himself recorded his assessment in his diary, written in the desert heat of the Tunisian winter. The entry for February 15, 1943, includes a passage that was captured by British intelligence and forwarded to every Allied headquarters in the Mediterranean theatre. The Americans fight bravely as individuals, but their leadership is timid, and their reactions are slow. When struck, they pause. When flanked, they retreat rather than turn and fight. They have not yet learned what we learnt in France in 1940. That speed of response is itself a weapon, perhaps the most important weapon. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, Personal Diary, February 15, 1943. The assessment was accurate, and it reached the one man in the American military hierarchy most qualified to understand exactly why it was accurate, and exactly how to fix it. Marshall received the Kasserine after-action reports in Washington in late February 1943. He read them in full. He then made what was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential personnel decisions of the war. He fired Lloyd Fredendall. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of II Corps during the Kasserine disaster, was a man who embodied every failing Marshall had spent 5 years trying to train out of the American officer corps. Fredendall commanded from a heavily fortified underground headquarters 70 miles behind the front. He communicated through elaborate written orders. He centralized decision-making to a degree that left his subordinate commanders with no room for initiative. When Rommel attacked, the American response was slow because it could not be fast. The command structure Marshall had tried to dismantle was precisely what Fredendall had rebuilt. To replace Fredendall, Marshall chose Lieutenant General George S. Patton, a man who had attended Marshall's lectures at Fort Benning, who had absorbed the doctrine of immediate counterattack so completely that it had become not a professional guideline but a personal identity. Patton arrived at III Corps headquarters on March 6, 1943. Within 48 hours, he had fired or reassigned every officer who had demonstrated hesitation at Kasserine. Within 2 weeks, II Corps was attacking again. The speed of the transformation stunned Allied observers. British General Sir Harold Alexander, who commanded all Allied ground forces in Tunisia, and who had watched the Kasserine disaster with barely concealed contempt for American military competence, wrote to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff on March 18, 1943, "I am frankly astonished by the recovery. Patton appears to have changed not just the headquarters but the spirit of the Corps. The Americans are attacking where a week ago they were running. I do not fully understand it, but I cannot deny the result." General Sir Harold Alexander, letter to Chief of the Imperial General Staff, March 18, 1943, but the Kasserine failure also revealed something important about the doctrine, something that Marshall had anticipated, but that the army had not fully worked through. Immediate counterattack doctrine worked when junior leaders had been trained to exercise independent judgment. It failed catastrophically when those junior leaders either had not been trained, as was the case with many of the officers who fought at Kasserine, who had received their commissions through the massive expansion of 1941 and 1942, or when the command culture above them penalized initiative. The doctrine was not just about what sergeants and lieutenants did, it was about what colonels and generals permitted. An army that trained platoons to counterattack, but promoted commanders who penalized unauthorized action, was training men for a doctrine they could never actually employ. This understanding shaped Marshall's personnel decisions for the rest of the war, with a consistency that his colleagues sometimes found brutal. Officers who demonstrated caution at the expense of initiative were relieved without ceremony, and without the kind of explanations that might discourage future commanders from accepting risk. The message was clear, and it traveled through the army with the speed of institutional rumor. Marshall would rather have an aggressive officer who was occasionally wrong than a cautious officer who was consistently safe. Safety, in Marshall's calculus, was not a neutral position. Safety was a decision to let the enemy choose the outcome. Patton understood this perfectly. He institutionalized it in II Corps and later in the Third Army with a fervor that sometimes alarmed even Marshall himself. But the result, in Sicily and Normandy, in the breakout from the hedgerows, and finally in the race across France, was an army that had internalized something unprecedented, the conviction that the best response to a blow was not to absorb it, but to return it. The British watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and unease. Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British Eighth Army in North Africa, and later the Allied ground forces at Normandy, articulated his own doctrine with a precision that highlighted exactly where it differed from Marshall's. I do not attack until I am ready. I do not move until I know I can succeed. The graveyard of military history is full of commanders who attack too soon. I intend to be careful. Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, addressed to 8th Army Staff, July 1942. Montgomery's critics, including Patton, who despised him with a sustained passion that lasted the rest of their lives, pointed out that this philosophy, however prudent, meant that the enemy also had time to prepare, time that the Americans were trained to deny them. The question of which approach was right would not be settled in North Africa or Sicily or even Normandy. It would be settled in the frozen forests of Belgium in December 1944, when both doctrines faced their ultimate examination simultaneously. Before the war, before North Africa, before Bastogne, Marshall had one opportunity to test his doctrine on the scale of an actual army, not platoons or companies, not even divisions. An army, the Louisiana maneuvers, September 1941. The largest military exercise in American history up to that point, 472,000 soldiers, across 3,400 square miles of Louisiana bayou country, conducting a simulated campaign that would become the proving ground for the officer corps that would fight the Second World War. The exercise pitted the Second Army against the Third Army. The Second Army's commander was Lieutenant General Ben Lear, methodical, experienced, conventional. The Third Army was commanded by Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, with a brilliant young colonel serving as his chief planning officer, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would within 3 years be commanding all Allied forces in Western Europe. But the officer whose performance in the Louisiana maneuvers most directly vindicated Marshall's doctrine and catapulted him from obscurity to national fame was the commander of 2nd Armored Division. Flying his personal pennant from his tank, orchestrating a 200-mile armored thrust that the exercise's referees initially refused to credit because it had happened too fast to be realistic. George S. Patton, Patton's 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, executed precisely the kind of deep, rapid, initiative-driven exploitation that Marshall had been preaching since Fort Benning. When the exercise scenario created an opportunity, Patton did not wait for authorization. He moved. When his flanks were exposed, he kept moving rather than stopping to secure them. When conventional doctrine said to consolidate, Patton's tanks kept rolling south through the Louisiana night. The umpires initially stopped the exercise and debated whether Patton had violated the rules. Their conclusion: he had not violated any rules, because no rule had anticipated that any commander would move that fast. The press corps covering the maneuvers had a field day. The New York Times correspondent covering the Louisiana exercises was Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., who would later enter politics and serve as a senator. His dispatch from the field captured the spectacle with an accuracy that transcended journalism. General Patton's armored division moves with a speed and decisiveness that leaves the defending forces and the exercise umpires simply unable to catch up. It is less a military exercise than a demonstration that our ideas about how fast an army can move need to be completely revised. Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., New York Times, September 19, 1941. What Lodge was describing, without knowing it, was Marshall's doctrine operating at full effectiveness. The speed was not accidental. The decisiveness was not temperamental genius, though Patton certainly had that in abundance. It was the product of a command culture that had been systematically built over 14 years to operate this way, to make decisions before the enemy had processed the previous one, to attack before the defense had consolidated, to treat every moment of hesitation as a resource transferred to the enemy. The Louisiana maneuvers produced another result that was less celebrated but equally important for the development of American doctrine. They revealed which officers were capable of operating in this environment and which were not. Marshall attended the final after-action review in person, sitting in the front row of a folding chair in a field outside Shreveport. He watched, and he made notes. Those notes became the most important personnel document of the pre-war Army, a mental list of officers who had demonstrated the qualities his doctrine required, and a longer list of officers who had not. Colonel Mark Clark, who served as an observer during the Louisiana maneuvers, later described watching Marshall take notes during the review. He wasn't writing down tactical lessons, he was writing down names, men who had moved fast and men who had hesitated, men who had made decisions and men who had asked for guidance. It wasn't an exercise critique, it was a personnel review of the entire Army. General Mark Clark, Memoir Calculated Risk, 1950. The Louisiana maneuvers also revealed, with uncomfortable clarity, the gap between American and Allied doctrine, a gap that would persist through the entirety of the war and that would become operationally significant at every major joint operation from Sicily to the Rhine. British observers assigned to the Louisiana exercises filed reports back to London that were, in retrospect, remarkably prescient. Lieutenant Colonel Eric Dorman Smith, serving as a British observer, wrote to the War Office in October 1941, "The Americans are training an army that will fight differently from ours. Their junior leaders are expected to act without orders in ways that our officers would consider insubordinate. Their concept of mission-type orders, giving the objective without specifying the method, produces fast action at the cost of coordination. This will create problems when our forces operate jointly. It will also, I think, produce an army that is very difficult to stop once it gets moving." Dorman Smith was right on all counts. The coordination problems he predicted would manifest at Anzio, at Caen, and throughout the campaign in northwest Europe. The difficulty to stop quality he identified would manifest most dramatically in the Ardennes, when the Germans discovered that an army trained by Marshall's doctrine did not stop moving forward simply because it had been struck from a direction it hadn't expected. But before the Ardennes, before Bastogne, before the ultimate test, Marshall's doctrine would encounter one more significant challenge. Not from the enemy, from the logic of industrial war itself. A doctrine of immediate counterattack is philosophically elegant. It is also, in practical terms, extraordinarily demanding in its material requirements. An army that counterattacks immediately must be supplied continuously and at forward positions. It cannot pause to consolidate logistics before acting, because the doctrine forbids pausing. It must carry its ammunition, fuel, and food with it, or have them available in sufficient quantity close enough to reach without stopping the forward momentum. This is not a minor logistical challenge. It is, arguably, the central challenge of mechanized offensive warfare. The American answer to this challenge was not primarily tactical, it was industrial. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 88,430 tanks, 257,390 artillery pieces, 2,434,428 trucks, and 300,317 military aircraft. These numbers are so large as to be almost meaningless in the abstract. Their operational meaning becomes clear only when compared with the forces they were supporting. The Wehrmacht, fighting a two-front war of its own design, produced 46,857 tanks and self-propelled guns in the same period, slightly over half the American total, while simultaneously fighting the Soviet Union, which was itself producing 84,070 tanks. The arithmetic of industrial production was not a background condition of the Second World War. It was the decisive factor. Rommel understood this when he said famously that his campaigns were decided not on the battlefield, but in the factories. But the relationship between industrial production and Marshall's doctrine was more subtle than simple numerical superiority. The doctrine of immediate counterattack required something specific from industry: abundance of supply at the unit level, not just in aggregate. A platoon that has been trained to counterattack immediately will use more ammunition than a platoon that has been trained to hold defensive positions and fire deliberately. An armored division executing a rapid exploitation will consume fuel at 2 to 3 times the rate of a division advancing cautiously. The doctrine created demand. The American industrial economy was the only economy in the world capable of meeting it. The factories that supplied this demand were themselves a story of American mobilization. That has few parallels in history. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, purpose-built in 1941 in less than a year, covering 113 acres under one roof, was producing M4 Sherman tanks at a rate of 1 every 29 hours by 1943. The workforce of 11,000 included significant numbers of women, who operated precision machine tools producing components toleranced to 105 thousandths of an inch. The Ford Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, was producing B-24 Liberator bombers. At peak production, it was building one bomber every 63 minutes. The plant employed 42,331 workers on 3 shifts, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These production rates had a direct tactical effect that went beyond simply providing more equipment. They produced something else, a culture of abundance at the unit level that allowed American commanders to operate in ways that German commanders could not. A German panzer commander in December 1944 had to carefully husband his fuel, his ammunition, his replacement parts, because resupply was uncertain, slow, and frequently inadequate. He could not make tactical decisions without considering logistical consequences, because a mistake in logistics meant his tanks stopped permanently. An American tank commander in December 1944, trained in the doctrine of immediate response, had a different calculation. His training told him to act. His supply situation, more often than not, allowed him to act. The two elements, doctrine and material, reinforced each other in a way that multiplied the effectiveness of both. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, understood this relationship instinctively. Abrams, who would later rise to become Army Chief of Staff and give his name to the M1 Abrams main battle tank, was in December 1944 the officer responsible for breaking through to Bastogne. In the planning sessions before the relief operation, Abrams reportedly brushed aside concerns from supply officers about fuel availability with a directness that captured the doctrine precisely. "My tanks will be moving too fast to run out of fuel. Get it to me on the road, or don't worry about it at all." Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, 37th Tank Battalion, Planning Session, December 23, 1944. As reported by Major Albin Irzig, the contrast with German logistics was not lost on Allied planners. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, had been planned in part around capturing American fuel dumps to sustain the German advance. The panzer columns expected to seize sufficient American fuel to reach the Meuse River because German fuel production and supply lines were incapable of sustaining the operation on their own. The German plan was a confession, embedded in its own operational concept, that German industry could no longer support German doctrine. The American plan was something different. The supply system assumed that American units would move so fast that resupply would be continuous and forward-positioned, because the units would never stop long enough for it not to be. The doctrine created the logistics requirement. The industry met the requirement. The combination produced something the German High Command had systematically underestimated: an army that could be hit hard, absorb the blow, and come back at you before you had time to reload. George Marshall was promoted to General of the Army, 5 stars, In December 1944, the same month his doctrine was tested at the Battle of the Bulge, President Roosevelt had wanted to give him the command of Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion, which Marshall had helped design. Marshall declined, telling Roosevelt that he could not in conscience leave his post in Washington, where he was managing the global strategic direction of the entire American war effort. Instead, he stayed in Washington. He planned. He organized. He managed the most complex logistical operation in human history. He fought with Congress over resources. He wrote the letters to the parents of dead soldiers that he considered until the end of his life to be the most important work he did. And the army he had built at Fort Benning in the Louisiana maneuvers, through the personnel decisions of 1942 and 1943, through the reforms he had insisted upon after Kasserine, won the war in Europe. The doctrine of immediate counterattack did not die with the Second World War. It became the foundation of post-war American military thinking, codified in the 1954 edition of Field Manual 1005, Operations, and elaborated in the Army's Active Defense Doctrine of the 1970s and the AirLand Battle Doctrine of 1982, a concept that emphasized precisely the elements Marshall had pioneered: deep operations, rapid exploitation, decentralized initiative, and the aggressive refusal to allow an enemy to consolidate any advantage. The AirLand Battle Doctrine was written by a generation of officers who had studied the Second World War with professional thoroughness and who had drawn from it exactly the lessons Marshall had embodied, that in modern warfare, speed of decision was as important as weight of fire, that the unit that maintained initiative controlled the battle, and that the proper response to being hit was to hit back faster than the enemy could reload. General William Depew, who commanded the Army's Training and Doctrine Command in the early 1970s, and who was the primary architect of the AirLand Battle Doctrine, articulated his debt to Marshall's legacy with characteristic directness. Everything we did at TRADOC in the 70s was an argument about what Marshall had already proven correct. He had proven that speed beats mass, that initiative beats coordination, that the best defense is always an immediate offensive action. We were just writing it down more carefully. General William Depew, Commander, Training and Doctrine Command, addressed to Army War College, 1975. 00. The lineage from Marshall's Fort Benning to Depuy's AirLand battle to the army that fought in the Gulf War in 1991 and in Iraq in 2003 is direct and unbroken. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, commanding coalition forces in Operation Desert Storm, employed a variant of the immediate counterattack philosophy at the operational level. The famous left hook through the Iraqi desert was a massive envelopment designed to move faster than the Iraqi army could respond, denying it time to adapt or withdraw to prepared positions. The operation succeeded in 100 hours of ground combat, a speed that stunned observers around the world and that would not have surprised George Marshall in the slightest. Marshall himself did not live to see the Gulf War. He died on October 16, 1959, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, having served as Secretary of State under Truman, as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War, and as the designer of the Marshall Plan for European Reconstruction, for which he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953, the only professional soldier ever to do so. The citation for the Nobel Prize did not mention Fort Benning or the Louisiana maneuvers, or the doctrine of immediate counterattack. It mentioned the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Europe, the generosity of a nation that had defeated its enemies and then helped to rebuild them. But those who knew Marshall's military work understood that the peace the Marshall Plan was trying to secure had been purchased, in part, by the doctrine he had spent 15 years building. The doctrine that had produced the army that arrived in Belgium in December 1944, already knowing at the cellular level that the correct response to being hit was to hit back before the enemy could hit again. 00. Omar Bradley, who had learned the doctrine at Marshall's Knee in Fort Benning, who had commanded the 12th Army Group through the Battle of the Bulge, who had watched the doctrine work in conditions Marshall himself could not have imagined, wrote the most precise assessment of Marshall's legacy in his own memoir, published in 1951. Marshall never commanded a division in combat. He never led an army in battle. What he did was more important than either of those things. He decided what kind of soldiers we would be before any of us had seen a German in our gun sights. And when we saw them, we knew what to do, not because someone told us, but because we'd been made into men who knew. General of the Army Omar N. Bradley, A Soldier's Story, 1951. In the summer of 1964, a reunion was held in Washington, D.C., for surviving veterans of the 101st Airborne Division and the 4th Armored Division, the defenders of Bastogne, and the men who broke the siege. General Anthony McAuliffe attended. Creighton Abrams, by then a lieutenant general and rising toward the Army's senior command, attended. Among the attendees were several former German officers who had been invited by the American Veterans Association, men who had fought around Bastogne in December 1944, who now represented the Federal Republic of Germany's Bundeswehr as military liaisons, partners in a NATO alliance that had transformed yesterday's enemies into today's allies. 31st, one of the former German officers at the 1964 reunion, was Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, who had served on the staff of the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive and who had spent the post-war years writing what became one of the most respected German analyses of the Second World War, Panzer Battles, published in 1956. Von Mellenthin was interviewed by a journalist from the Army Times at the reunion, and his remarks were published in the August 1964 edition. The journalist asked von Mellenthin what had surprised him most about the American Army in the Ardennes. His answer was immediate and precise. The speed. Not the speed of their tanks or their trucks. We expected that, and frankly our own vehicles were often faster. The speed of their decisions. From the moment we struck, there were American counteractions. Not eventually. Immediately. Every time we created a situation we thought would require them to pause and think, they were already moving. It was as if they did not need to think because they had already thought about it, had thought about exactly this situation, exactly this problem, and had their answer ready. That is not natural. That is training. That is a philosophy embedded so deeply it becomes instinct. Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, 5th Panzer Army, interview with Army Times, August 1964. Von Mellenthin was describing Fort Benning. He was describing the Louisiana maneuvers. He was describing 15 years of George Marshall's conviction that the first 5 seconds of a firefight were the most important 5 seconds in the battle, and that those seconds had to be decided by training rather than thought. The reunion is remembered by those who attended it as a strange and moving occasion. Men who had tried to kill each other 20 years earlier now shaking hands in a Washington hotel ballroom, comparing memories of frozen Belgian forests, and examining the gap between what each side had expected and what each side had found. McAuliffe, who had retired from the army as a general and was by 1964 working in the private sector, was asked by a reporter to reflect on the Bastogne experience, specifically on the decision to reply nuts to the German surrender demand. His answer revealed, perhaps better than any tactical analysis, the essential character of the doctrine he had embodied. "I didn't think about it for very long," McAuliffe said. "There didn't seem to be much to think about. They asked if we wanted to quit. We didn't want to quit, so the answer was no. I said it the short way." The reporter asked if he had considered the possibility that the Germans would follow through on their threat to annihilate the garrison. McAuliffe looked at the reporter for a moment before answering. Sure, that they were going to do that anyway if they could. The question wasn't whether they were going to try. The question was whether we were going to help them by quitting first. We weren't. That was Marshall's doctrine, expressed by one of his most successful students in the simplest possible terms. Not tactical sophistication. Not operational art. The refusal, embedded so deeply it required no deliberation, to allow the enemy to choose the outcome. Today, the principles Marshall established at Fort Benning between 1927 and 1932 are visible in virtually every military training program in the Western world. Mission Command, the doctrine of giving subordinates an objective and the freedom to achieve it, is the stated philosophy of the United States Army, the British Army, the German Bundeswehr, and every NATO partner force. The concept of immediate action drills, of building reflexive responses to ambush and attack, of training soldiers to move toward fire rather than away from it. These are universal elements of modern infantry training, traceable in direct lineage to the man who stood in front of his instructors at Fort Benning and said that the worst thing you could do in a firefight was nothing. Among the thousands of artifacts that crowd the vast exhibition halls, there is a glass display case containing 3 items that sit together without explanation. Visitors must read the placard to understand what connects them. The first item is a copy of the German surrender demand delivered to Bastogne on December 22, 1944, a formal document, carefully typed on Wehrmacht stationery, politely requesting that Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe surrender his garrison with full honors of war. The second item is McAuliffe's one-word reply. The third item is a small handwritten note, a fragment of a training memo written at Fort Benning, Georgia, in 1929, in the precise, careful handwriting of Colonel George C. Marshall. The note reads, "The men who will fight our next war are training today. What we teach them now is what they will do then. Teach them to wait for orders, and they will wait when orders cannot come. Teach them to act, and they will act when everything depends on it." Colonel George C. Marshall, Fort Benning Training Memorandum, 1929. The museum card beneath the display case reads simply, "These 3 documents tell the same story." It is the story of an idea, a simple, radical, counterintuitive idea that was born in the lecture halls of Fort Benning, Georgia, tested in the deserts of North Africa, proven in the hedgerows of Normandy, and vindicated in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where the Germans threw everything they had left at an army that had been trained, from the bottom up, to do one specific thing when struck: hit back, immediately, before the enemy could reload. 5430 Model had asked the right question, standing in that farmhouse outside Prum on December 17, 1944. Who trained these men? The answer was a colonel from Pennsylvania who had spent 5 years watching the army do things the wrong way and 15 years building the right way from the ground up. A man who never commanded a division in combat, never led an army in battle, never fired a shot in anger after the First World War ended in 1918. A man who understood more completely than any officer of his generation that wars are won not in the moment of battle, but in the years of preparation that precede it. That the first 5 seconds of a firefight are decided by the previous 5 years of training. That the correct response to being hit, the only correct response, the response that every private and corporal and sergeant and lieutenant and captain must know in their blood and their bone, is not to assess, not to coordinate, not to wait for guidance from above. The correct response is to act. The Germans in the Ardennes called them unberechenbar, unpredictable. They meant it as a criticism. It was the most accurate description of George Marshall's life's work that his enemies ever produced, and it was, in the end, the reason they lost.